Welcome to the regular meeting of the City of Santa Barbara Water Commission. It's Thursday, February 17th, 2022. Call the meeting to order and start with a roll call of the commissioners present. Madam Clerk.
Yes, Council Member Sneddon.
Here.
Commissioner Keller.
Here.
Commissioner Kammeier is absent. Commissioner Cooney.
Here.
Vice Chair Young.
Present.
And Chair Davis.
Here.
Thank you.
Are there any changes to the agenda this morning?
There are no changes, Chair Davis.
Great. Takes us to item 4, public comment. This is for anyone from the public to speak on items within the purview of the Water Commission, but not on today's agenda. Wait a second, but Madam Clerk, do we have anyone with a raised hand, anyone wishing to speak under general public comment?
Chair Davis, we do not have public comment at this time.
Great. Takes us to item 5. This is the consent items. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them. First one is the meeting minutes for the meeting of January 20th, 2022. Item B, 5B, report of the emergency purchase order to replace the El Estero Water Resources Center Substation B transformer. Item 5C is contract for design of El Estero Water Resources Center SCADA SCADA upgrades project. D, the 5D, the adoption of the resolution for a lease amendment with the State of California State Lands Commission to allow continued placement of unused wastewater outfall pipeline. Item 5D, contract for construction support services for the fiscal year 2022 wastewater main rehabilitation project. Before we go to any comments, I do have a correction on the minutes. If you want to look on the minutes themselves, we show on the roll call, all commissioners present except Davis and Kammeier. That was a carryover. It's actually Keller. But with that small change, do we have any comments or questions on any of the consent calendar items? No, not seeing any. Do I have a motion?
I move to approve.
A motion by Commissioner Keller. Is there a second?
Sure, I'll second.
Commissioner Young made the second. Madam Clerk, could you call a roll call vote on that item?
Yes, thank you. I will note that change. Commissioner Keller.
Yes.
Commissioner Kammeier is absent. Commissioner Cooney.
Yes.
Vice Chair Young.
Yes.
And Chair Davis.
Yes, that motion passes 4-0 with 1 absent. Takes us to our administrative items. The first item, 6A, is the proposed updates to the wastewater rates. Mr. Hagmark, you want to kick this one off?
Yes, thank you. Chair Davis, Commissioners, we've got a lot of great feedback from you at our January Water Commission meeting, which sent us back to looking at the proposed rates. And what our big takeaway, and we'll get into this in more detail, was really how quickly our water supply situation may be changing here. And so what we did is took the time to do some additional analysis to take a look at that and really try to build into the rates. What if we find ourselves in the need to ask for mandatory water conservation? How will that impact wastewater rates? And so we've gone through and made some changes to this, along with addressing, I think, I don't remember exactly who mentioned this, but also the fact that we are in a new normal of wastewater, of water usage, which means we are in a new normal of wastewater discharges from our customers. And so we took a new look at that. And so with that, I want to turn it over to Ms. Hoffenberg to kind of kick off the conversation specifically about how that trickled down and impacted the rate study. So with that, thank you.
Good morning, Chair and Commissioners. My name is Dana Hoffenberg. I'm a Water Resources Analyst, and I'm going to give you an overview today of what we're going to be talking about before I hand things over to Mr. Korn, our expert rate consultants. Next slide, please. So briefly touching on what Joshua was just speaking about, I wanted to go over what we discussed last time when we spoke with you in January. So we did talk about water conservation assumptions in the model, and we talked about how we are currently in a pretty dry condition and there are potentially new state regulations coming down. So we wanted to make sure we considered those items. We also did talk a bit about the residential cap on wastewater charges, and we talked about if it would be appropriate to do some more analysis to see if that cap was set at the right level. It is currently set at 10 HCF for our single-family residential customers. Next slide, please. So just going over a summary of some updates to the rate model and rate design. So first off, again, water conservation. Originally, the model had 0.2% assumed annual conservation. What we did is we did bump that up to 2% annually for our residential customers during the 3-year rate making period. That does have effects on the rates. That does increase our overall revenue requirement from 6% to about 7% on average. So you'll recall last time when we spoke with you in January, we did talk about having a revenue requirement of about 6%. The model is now reflecting a 7%. And just as a reminder, this is an overall system revenue requirement. So how that impacts individual bills will vary depending on the customer class. Mr. Hagmark, did you have something to add?
Yes, I just wanted to also remind the Water Commission that when we're going through this process, again, we're establishing methodology for the highest rates that the council can ultimately adopt. Certainly, if we find ourselves in a much better water supply situation, we get a miracle month of March that occurs, the council, even if we move forward with the current rate, noticing the council could adopt something lower if we find our situation is improved. But I think the point was made in January. We need to be planning for, I won't say the worst case scenario, but a scenario that is likely to play out given that we've had basically no rainfall in January and no rainfall now in February. Thank you.
Thanks for adding that. Yeah, that's an important distinction. So moving on to some other things that we talked about, and this more goes into rate design, as we did discuss the residential cap. Currently, there's a residential cap for 10 HCF for our single family residential customers and for our small multifamily customers. So that's properties with 2 to 4 dwelling units. We took a look at winter water usage trends, which is a good indicator of how much water is being used indoors versus outdoors, which is a proxy for how much water is being discharged to our wastewater system versus it's just being used for irrigation purposes. And we found that our customers' winter water usage for single family was more in line with 8 HCF rather than 10 HCF. Our customers have been making some permanent and sustained changes to their water usage patterns since the drought. So we are proposing that that cap be lowered for single family from 10 to 8 HCF throughout the rate making period. We also found that for our small multi-unit family properties, there's not really a difference between their winter water usage and their summer water usage. And what this indicates to us is there's not very much of a strong irrigation pattern happening at these properties. So the vast majority of water that is being used at these properties is being discharged into the wastewater treatment system and is going to the Ellisdale Water Resource Center for treatment. So we are recommending that we eliminate the cap for that customer class. And if you recall last rate study, we did already eliminate the cap for the larger multi-unit customer class. So it would just be making all of our multifamily customer class have no cap and have some consistency there. And lastly, for our commercial customers, our analysis just indicated we need to do a little bit of recalibration for our wastewater minimum charges to be more in line with our cost of service analysis. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and ask for the next slide and also turn it over to Mr. Korn, our rate consultant.
Thank you, Ms. Offenberg. Good morning, Chair Davis, Commissioners, and Council Member Snedden. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you again. As we kicked off many of these meetings recently and in the past, I just want to remind you all of our overall goals as we go through this process. And really, it boils down to a primary goal of providing sufficient revenue to operate and maintain the city's wastewater infrastructure through cost-based and proportional rates that meet the requirements of Proposition 218. And that's really what this whole process is about. And if you remember, it's a three-step process. As Ms. Offenberg noted earlier, it was a 6 to 7% overall. That's that system, right? That's the revenue requirement component. We then need to go into the cost of service to determine the proportionality for the rates for each customer class of service or your rate schedule. So your single family, multifamily, commercial, and commercial high strength customers. So as we go through that process, that gives us the basis for the requirements of 218. And then we can develop rates to meet those overall requirements that reflect our cost of service analysis. So this morning, I'm going to walk you through the updated revenue requirement, as mentioned earlier, with the changes and discussion from the last Water Commission meeting. And then we'll talk through the overall the results of the cost of service and the recommended rates. Now, as we go through this process, remember, we're also maintaining prudent financial planning criteria. So that's making sure that we're meeting our target debt service coverage ratio. So those legal contracts from when you've issued past debt, or if and when you issue future debt that we need to maintain over the long term. We also want to ensure that we're funding adequate capital projects through rates on an annual basis. We talked a couple times about that reinvestment in the system or the renewal and replacement needs that to maintain the system at an adequate level. And then finally, one of the other key is meeting the council minimum reserve balances as we go through this long-term review. So as we do this, we base the study on generally accepted methodologies, but again, they're tailored to your specific system and customer characteristics so that we provide the unique unit costs at the end of the cost of service that'll develop the proposed rates. Next slide. So I'll start off with the revenue requirement. Remember, this is the first of our three analyses. And on the next slide, we have our summary of the key assumptions. So Ms. Offenberg already touched on this. We did, based on our discussion with you all, went back and took a look at this in our single family and multifamily, so our residential customers. We've reduced by 2% annually in fiscal years 23, 24, and 25. Our commercial and commercial high stayed at that 0.2% conservation for that same time period. Given when we look at the consumption patterns, what that looks like with the recent pandemic and where things are moving going forward. The O&M, remember, our operations and maintenance expenses are based on the fiscal year 2022 budget. And then we've adjusted that out into the out year. So for fiscal year 23, this upcoming budget year, starting here in 4 months or 5 months here, we've adjusted that to reflect what we talk about as known and measurable changes. So as an example, chemical costs have increased lately. And so we built that into the overall budget for this upcoming budget year in the rate study document. Moving forward, so fiscal year 24 and out, that average inflationary increase is 3.5%. So as we talked a little bit about last time when we met, current inflation is, depending on the indices, 5 to 7 or a little bit more percent in recent months, so year over year. This is the historical level of inflation that we've built out into the future. So as Mr. Hagmark noted, when we adopt if and when the council adopts these rates, they are the maximum rates that can be implemented. So as we go through this, we want to try and put the best information we know today into this as we project out over the next 3-year period. As we go through this, as we've talked, capital improvements are a primary concern, and that capital funding analysis provides an overall calculation of what the impacts to rates is going to be on the long term as well. And I keep talking about long term. For the model, remember, we're focusing on the next 3 years for rates, fiscal years 23, 24, and 25, but we're actually looking out 10 years to develop that plan. And so as we look out over that time period to fund those capital improvements, we're looking at issuing additional long-term debt, low interest loans in this case for funding, and then the remaining being funded through that annual reinvestment or the rate funding component and available reserves as we go out into the future. So as we look at the next slide, this is that same summary of that capital plan and the funding analysis. This has not changed since we met last month, but just wanted to remind you as we look at this, starting with fiscal year 22 and going out through fiscal year 32, that's our long-term financial plan that we're looking at. Our rates are set for fiscal year 23, 4, and 5. And as part of that, you see a bit of a spike in there. And this is the El Estero electrical upgrade project, as well as the Bramer lift station component. You can see those run in 23, 25 and fiscal year 23 respectively. And so as you go out over the long term, that capital plan starts to get back to normal. So when we think about how we fund capital improvement projects, these one-time large projects, which the two listed here on the page are generally one-time projects that aren't ongoing every year, we look at what those alternative funding sources may be. So in this case, that green part of each bar in each year, or the upper bar, is the debt-funded component. And so that's where that's the low-interest loans being issued for the electrical upgrade project, as well as the Bramer lift station, and then out as we go into the future for some of the other, what I'll say is larger one-time capital projects. If you notice the black or dark blue bar at the bottom, that is our rate-funded capital line. That's our reinvestment in the system on an annual basis. And as you look at that from fiscal year 23 out to fiscal year 32, we're trying to stair-step that in over time as rates and overall funding needs allow to reach those adequate levels to maintain the system for the long term through that annual renewal and replacement component. So that's always an important long-term aspect. You can see in fiscal year 23 through 25, fairly level. It pops up a little bit. We're using reserves and debt to balance that out to minimize the impacts to rates of these large one-time projects as best as we can. So given the overall capital funding, on the next slide, then we can go into the overall revenue requirement analysis. So remember, our revenue requirement is made up of total operations and maintenance expense, our rate funded capital, so that bottom portion of the prior chart, any additional current or future long-term debt. So as we talked about, issuing debt out into the future for these projects, and then any reserve funding. So if we take a look at fiscal year 22, the bar to the left of this slide, you see our O&M is the black or dark blue bar at the bottom. We add to that our rate funded capital. You'll see a little sliver of reserve funding in there, the orange in the middle between the blue and the green on top, which is our net debt service. As we go out into the future for fiscal years 23 through 27, that's our projection of our O&M expenses for the dark bottom bar. Our rate funded capital starts increasing slightly over time to meet our overall funding requirements. And then you'll see starting in fiscal year 25, we bring in a little bit of additional debt that's based on those low interest loans and the timing for those projects as we go out into the future. That the top of each of those bars is our total revenue requirement. The dashed line, which is you can possibly see is slightly angled downward, that is our current revenues based on the rates that are in place today. And so that's declining now. You could probably, if you got your magnifying glass out during the last presentation, you might have seen a slight decline of 0.2%. You can kind of see the trend going down at 2% now in the short term. So the goal, the overall revenue requirement is then to take that dashed line and get revenues up to the top of each of the bars to prudently fund the overall operating and capital expenses of the wastewater utility. So on the next slide, we have a summary of this. And really looking at, annual adjustments are necessary to fund the wastewater system. And that's really to meet annual inflationary impacts and staffing adjustments, our annual capital funding needs, and maintaining reserves at council level policies. And then also making sure we meet all of those financial metrics that are necessary to issue long-term debt. So as when we're thinking back to the capital funding analysis, we have additional long-term debt planned through the low interest loans, planned for some of those larger projects. And so we need to make sure we have the financial ability to issue that debt for the long term. Now, as we talked about the system-wide adjustment, you can see here is 7% in fiscal year 23, 6.5% in 24 and 25. That's the system-wide. That's the total increase in revenues to meet the needs. That's not the bill impact that customers may see after we go through the cost of service and recommended rate structure adjustments and that final customer bill that your customers will see. So on the bottom page here, the bottom of this page here, you can see what those average bills are for a single family customer. Just as a note, those are the recommended. Right, so this is based on the results of the cost of service and the rate adjustments that were talked about earlier, rate structure adjustments that Stauffenberg talked about a little bit earlier. And so you'll see that's about a $3.63 increase in 23, just over $5 in 24, and just about $4.50 in 25. Again, that doesn't tie to your 7%, 6.5, and 6.5. This is after the cost of service and with the rate structure adjustments that we'll talk about here next. So that gives us our overall revenue need. Then on the next slide, then we can start talking about our cost of service. And remember, a cost of service is a method to proportionally distribute the costs to each of the customer classes of service based on how they utilize the system. So the next slide gives us a little bit of the details of what we look at. And so when we go through a cost of service, it's a two-step process. We allocate costs based on why the city incurs this cost. So does the city incur the cost just to meet the volume needs? So the way to think about this is we need to take that wastewater from all the homes and businesses and get it to El Estero for treatment. And so that's a volume related cost. We're sizing the system around the overall volumes that we're going to need based on our customers' characteristics. When we think about the strength, it's how hard or difficult or timely or expensive it is to treat that wastewater. The higher the strength of the wastewater, the more expensive and costly in time it takes to treat that wastewater to meet your requirements to discharge that wastewater. So that drives a good portion of the treatment related costs on the system, is meeting those. Chemicals being one of those costs that we've seen increase over the last year or more, and how that may change out into the future. And then the final component on a cost of service, wastewater cost of service, is a customer related cost. And so this is a cost related to providing that basic service to customers. And this can be, meter reading, customer billing, accounting, those types of functions, as well as there's a portion of the system in place just to meet minimum customer needs. And so we've built that into this analysis as well. So we go through each line item of the revenue requirement, essentially the budget for the wastewater system. And then we determine what allocation factor is appropriate. Now, there are many of these are joint costs, right? You incur costs at El Estero Treatment Plant to meet a volume and a strength component. And so we want to make sure that we allocate those appropriately based on generally accepted methods, but based on how your system functions and operates. Once we know that, then we distribute those costs proportionally to each customer class of service. So our customer classes or our rate schedules are residential, commercial, commercial high, and I should say residential, single family, multifamily, and then our high strength surcharge customers as we go through this. So when we look at each of those allocated cost components for volume, strength, or customer, then we develop a distribution factor based on how each customer class uses that. So as an example, when we look at the volumes on the system, then we can see and look at what the overall volumes are for residential versus commercial, and that gives us a proportionality factor that we can then distribute those costs. So if residential is 50% of the volume, they're distributed 50% of the costs. Commissioner Young, do you have a question?
Thank you. Just kind of a follow-up to what you're currently talking about in terms of strength of wastewater. So prior to wastewater coming into El Estero, it's not being segregated, correct? So that you're not treating individual sources individually, but it's all being commingled into one big pot, so to speak. And whatever.
Agreed.
And so that strength, though, is dictating what additional treatment has to undertake in order to now treat all of it, because all the other wastewater is now being contaminated with the high strength stuff, which may have industrial chemicals in it or something like that. But
that's absolutely, oh, sorry.
So how much of an impact does the say commercial or industrial wastewater influent have on the needs to then treat, you know, everything that's coming in?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and maybe Ms. Leslie or others could chime in. I'll kind of kick it off from a technical perspective as we think about how we do that. You're exactly right in the instance that everything flows into the treatment plant at a single point. So we're collecting residential wastewater, commercial high wastewater. So it all combines in, and that drives the overall need. From a cost of service perspective, though, when we think about the strength levels, residential and commercial, your low, I refer to it as commercial low, have domestic level strength. And so it's the typical stuff that we deal with at the plant. What happens is we get those higher strength waste from the commercial high customers or the industrial customers, then that starts constraining the capacities at the plant because it takes a little longer to treat and may take more chemicals, et cetera, as we go through that process. So that's really what we're trying to capture in this cost of service, is what is the difference between those volumes and strength levels from these different customer classes and rate schedules, so that we're providing the correct rate to reflect those costs as part of it. And so that's why we have to do this cost of service, is because, you know, we don't have a pipe that comes from single family, a pipe that comes from industrial. So we have those specific measurements.
And tell me, I've heard of pre-treatment, meaning some categories have to pre-treat before they can even come into the system. Is that happening in
Correct.
the city? Okay.
There are a couple that are part of that program. It really has to deal with that high strength surcharge component. And so those customers are tested and monitored so that we have actual strength information and flow information from those customers. And so we know what that strength is coming into the city system. And so Ideally, the way it would work a lot of times is the pre-treatment process would bring customers down to the domestic level strength. So we don't have those high strength peaks that come into the system. And so, but not all pre-treatment systems are equal, I'll say, just with my work around the country. There's some things that get through, and so they have a high strength, in 1 month of their biochemical oxygen demand. And then the next month, it's the ammonia that's up, right? It's just the way things kind of factor in and what they're doing as a process on their side.
But then if the pre-treatment is working, aren't these other sources, if what you're saying is that the goal is to lower their strength down to a residential level, then aren't they out of the loop in terms of being a higher level of strength?
Correct. And so what would happen in the way we set this up for the city's rate schedules is if you go over that maximum threshold as a commercial high customer, you have the high strength surcharge. So if a customer is below that threshold, then they would not be charged the surcharge. That's the goal with that program, so that they're treating to a level where they aren't getting a surcharge. They're just paying the quote typical rate for the commercial high strength customer.
And that's what's going on with the city's influence from these different sources. Some are meeting these higher treatment or lower strength levels because of their pre-treatment. And we have others that are not so lucky and are still generating higher strength influent to the system.
Correct. There's only a few that are in that high strength surcharge piece that don't stay in that commercial high rate.
Right. Thank you,
Commissioner Keller.
Yeah, just a quick point. Strength comes in different flavors because, of course, as Dr. Korn was mentioning, you have, BOD, biochemical oxygen demand. You have nitrate, you have ammonia, you have different things that are present in our wastewater. And so, although someone may be pre-treating a particular aspect or particular chemical or type of chemicals, that's going to be different. And of course, industrial and commercial have generally a very different composition than what you would have with domestic. For example, a commercial laundry would be very different from any domestic source, or a brewery. So even though the chemicals may sound the same, their strengths on these different aspects are going to be very, very different. So that's why they do pre-treatment for some of those, and that's typical.
Thank you. Those are really good comments on this, because that's really what the heart of the cost of service is, to meet the intent and requirements of Proposition 218, so that we can come back and develop actual rates that reflect the costs that are placed on the system by these different customer classes. So on the next slide, what we have is a summary of our cost of service. And so what we do is we look at what is the current revenue that is generated from each class of service or rate schedule based on the current rates in place today. Then we compare that to the proportionally distributed costs on the system. So the bar on the left, or the darker bar, and is compared to the bar on the right, or the lighter blue bar, that is the distributed cost. So when you look at residential, currently, and this is for fiscal year 23 cost of service, so our first year of our analysis, then the residential customers generate $19.6 million of revenue. The distributed cost is $20.9 million. So that's where that residential class, we need to now generate that level of revenue through the rate designs. Our commercial class 1 to 3, that's that low commercial class, that's domestic strength commercial. You can see their revenue needs to go from 3.6 million to 3.9 million. Very similar on commercial high, 1.3 to 1.5. And then the high strength surcharge, so those customers that are their commercial high customers, but are going over the maximum limits on strength, that needs to increase from 133,000 to 143,000. Now, when we think about these numbers, those are kind of big dollar changes, but when we look at this across each class, they're very similar. And I attribute that to a couple things. The first one being you as a city have consistently done cost of service analyses every 3 to 5 years. So it's not a shock now that our results, I'll call these fairly tight results. They're all hovering around the overall system revenue need as we look at that from a percentage basis approach. And so that's one of the key drivers. The other is, I think, as we've seen, the reason we see some changes is because we've seen some changes in our characteristics throughout the pandemic, right? So we've seen some shifting in volumes from, to us being at home more frequently. That's changing it as we go forward. It feels like commercial may be coming back a little bit more as part of that process. And so that really, this first year is our reset year. And we have to do this every year with our cost of service every time you've completed one. We reset our rates and then we adjust for the next 2 years in this case for a 3-year rate schedule. And then the next time you come back, if characteristics have changed, then we'll, update and reset in that beginning year. But overall, this is really clean and tight. There were really no anomalies where one class of service here was outside that range of reasonableness. Everybody was within a couple percent of the overall system revenue need for fiscal year 23 of 7%. So given that, on the next slide, we now know our overall revenue requirement needs and we know how we need to collect it. And that cost of service also gives us unit costs, or the cost, the fixed charge and the volumetric charge that we put into the rate design. We can now go into that analysis. So we'll start off on the next slide with some of the key assumptions. And as we talked about, currently single family, so our build up to a maximum of 10 HCF. HCF is 100 cubic feet per month, and each 100 cubic feet is 748 gallons. Now, as was mentioned at the beginning, given some of our conversation at the prior meeting, we are looking and recommending to transition that 10 HCF cap down to 8 HCF. And that's really based on winter water data. And I'll show you a chart in a moment here to give you an example of what that looks like based on consumption data. On multifamily, this is our 2 to 4 units, so our smaller. They currently have the same 10 HCF cap per month. As Ms. Hoffenberg talked about, we're recommending eliminating that cap, as when we looked at the data, then that differential between winter and summer was very small. And, many of these customers have a separate irrigation meter on the water side, so they're not billed on that for their sewer rates as well. Multifamily, the larger 5+ units, it's based on water usage with no cap. That is, there's no recommended change there. And on non-residential, it's billed based on water usage with no cap. Now, the one difference on the non-residential customers is, so your commercial customers, the low and high, there's a minimum bill calculation. And so we looked at that minimum bill and we recalibrated that based on the cost of service unit cost. So, and get that back in line. So again, kind of a reset year for that. So I'm going to go on the next slide. I want to go back to our single family discussion and why we came back to adjust this. So this takes us, this is 12-month average residential gallons per capita per day, so GPCD. This is from approximately September of 2010 through March of 2022, so very recent data. What you see up here in the top left, you'll see a blue bar. You'll see that average is somewhere around, I think it's 87 gallons per capita per day on average. Then we went into the drought in the summer, fall of 2014. And we saw that average gallons per capita per day drop significantly, all the way down to somewhere in the 65 gallons per capita per day range. During the last rate study, so 3 years ago, we did talk about should we adjust this. At that time, we weren't sure if we had enough data to say, yes, it's definitively lower. We thought we may see some rebound, However, your customers have maintained those levels. You can see in that green line going across pretty consistently over the last 5-6 years as part of that. And so this gave us some additional data points to come back and say that this 8 HCF cap is more reflective of how your residential customers are utilizing the system from a wastewater volume generation perspective. So just thinking about how we're using water now indoors in those winter months is looking like that's coming back to that new normal, or that amount that we're going to be set at going forward for some time. So that gives you a little more background on that. On the next slide, as we go into our single family rate structure, there's a flat fixed charge, so a base fee per month, and then our variable charge up to the cap. So what you'll see here is 3 or actually 6 rows of the volume charge. Our current rate is $3.71 per 100 cubic feet up to 10. In 23, we reduced that to 9. In 24, down to 8, and then it stays at that 8. What we wanted to do is transition this in over a couple of years so that customers could get used to what that adjustment is going to be and minimize any bills out into the future, but also be able to provide that known change that's coming up into the future. So this represents that overall rate adjustment. You can see in the base fee going out, the adjustment to that monthly fixed charge, and then to the volume charge as we go through that. On the next slide, we have our multifamily customers. So again, they're billed very similarly. There's a base fee, fixed base fee, and then per dwelling unit. And then there's a volume charge up to the cap for the 1 to 4 dwelling units, and then no cap on the 5+ dwelling units. Our recommendation is to move on the 1 to 4 dwelling units, the small multifamily, to no cap, given the review of their information. And those rates then reflect the overall billing units on the system. Chair Davis?
Yeah, Sean, just quickly, we had talked at one point about levelizing some of these changes. What did you do in response to that inquiry that we had at that time?
Yeah, sorry, thank you for reminding me of that. So as we were going through this, when we talked a little bit more about this, is trying to balance that overall bill impact to each of those customers. And Raquel, can you go back to the prior slide for me? Thank you. And so one of the ways we did that, Chair Davis, is we went back and did phase this in over the 2 years. That helped minimize those impacts of that transition to the customer bills, because we were able to adjust over a 2-year period. So we weren't seeing the widespread of the impacts, right? It is much more compact and much more closer impacts for all of those customers, that use different levels of consumption over the year. And so that was one way we tried to adjust that. And you can see here, we're going up, about just under $3 in the base fee, and then it's just under $2. And then it's just again under $2, just under $2. And by doing that transition from 10 to 9 to 8, it gave us that ability to smooth that. So moving forward, the multifamily, same approach, with the exception of the 1 to 4 dwelling units. We did remove the cap in fiscal year 23. And then those rates are adjusted, same rates as the single family. So the next slide shows our commercial. So as I mentioned earlier, the commercial customers, this is our commercial 1 to 3, our low commercial or domestic strength commercial. They have a volume charge based on their water consumption, and that's at the bottom of this chart. So each 100 cubic feet of water is billed at those rates, but there's a minimum bill set by meter size. So what you can see here on the top half is the different meter sizes, a 5/8 inch meter all the way through a 10-inch meter. Just as a point of reference for this class, most of our meters are up in that 5/8 to 2-inch range. So there's a couple 3 and a couple 4, and I think 1 6-inch in this class. So if the volume charge based on their water does not meet that minimum, they're billed the minimum charge. This is the piece that we recalibrated, and we're recommending recalibrating this in fiscal year 24. So the column in the middle there, where you can see current rates, I'll just use a 5/8 as an example. We go to 43.39 today to 46.65 is the minimum, up to 51.69. Now, if you go down that fiscal year 24 column and compare it to the fiscal year 23, you're going to see some changes. Some of them are lower, some of them are higher. That's really the big part about the recalibration. Over the years, that relationship to the meter equivalencies has gone astray. So think about adding 5% a year to $1 versus 5% a year to $1,000. They start to diverge. They both go up, but one goes up faster. This is getting them back to the correct level for each of those meter sizes as part of this for those minimum bills based on our unit costs and our cost of service. So this is the commercial low. On the next slide, we have the commercial high. These are your higher strength commercial customers. Same approach. They are billed on a volumetric basis only and the minimum bill. So on the bottom of this chart, you see the water charge increasing based on our cost of service in fiscal year 23 and then adjusted overall in 24 and 25 by the overall revenue needs. And again, in fiscal year 24, recalibrating that minimum bill. Now you'll see in the high strength commercial, that minimum bill drops by about $2 for that 5/8 inch meter from $61 in fiscal year 23 to $59.70 in 24. And so that's that recalibration as well as reflecting our unit costs and our cost of service. And part of this adjustment by taking it out into 24 was to come back to a time period when we were, knock on wood here, out of the pandemic. Things are getting a little bit more back to normal at that point to adjust that overall. So that kind of applies to both of the commercial classes. And then finally, on the next slide, we have the high strength surcharge. And so this is the high strength surcharge for those customers that are in the high strength commercial class. And if they go over those strength limits, then there's the surcharge on a per pound basis. So thinking of those customers, they're monitored and tested. So we know the strength of the wastewater. We know the total amount, so we can calculate the total pounds, and we're charging in that manner. Now, this is impacted by the increase in chemical costs. You know, we have that built into our revenue requirement, but when we allocate those chemical costs are really there for the strength-related components. So what you can see here is our BOD, biochemical oxygen demand. That's staying flat for fiscal year 23, it's 32 cents per pound today. It'll stay at 32 cents per pound in fiscal year 23 and then adjust in the out years. Our TSS, or total suspended solids, is 42 cents. That's increasing to 46 cents and out. And then our ammonia is currently 98 cents per pound. That's increasing to $1.10 per pound. As we go through this process of evaluating why you incur costs, ammonia is a key driver in the cost of service right now. And that's why you see a little bigger proportional change in that overall component cost as part of this. So this is just for those customers that are tested, that are discharging higher strength waste than what is included in your regulations for your commercial high. And so with that, oh, yes, Commissioner Young.
Thank you. Just a question regarding the folks that are doing pre-treatment. Do we do any kind of auditing of you know, their submission of laboratory testing results?
I wouldn't call it an audit, but what I will say happens is those customers provide some testing results of theirs, and the city also does their own testing of that. And those two values for each of those, and it may be more than one in a month, it just depends on the schedule and timing and what's going on. those amounts are looked at and averaged to calculate that bill. So a lot of it can depend on the timing of those and what that looks like as part of that. So there is 2 tests going on, one by the customer, one by the city. Mr. Hagmark, did you want to add to that?
Well, yeah, I was going to say, Vice Chair Young, we do have extensive testing that goes on with our high strength customers so that we do understand what they're sending us, and it really depends on their permit that we have with them. It could be quarterly, it could be annually, depends on the level of strength and the variability of what they're discharging. Some of our customers, it's a very consistent, and so I think it's usually an annual check-in to make sure that the constituents are the same. So I hope that answers your question.
It does, and so I take it these are all outside laboratories that these customers are hiring to do the testing. It's not being done in-house.
Correct. Correct.
Okay. And so, but we're also testing on time and place samples that are consistent. Like if we know that they're submitting a sample from a given date, are we also taking a sample on that date just to compare accuracy?
We're trying to do that. Sometimes it's easier to do than others, but yeah, that's the intent, so that we have that ability to trust but verify.
And how's this been going on in terms of consistency between what our customers are submitting versus what our own testing results in-house are showing?
You're humming.
It really just depends on the customer, I should say. Particularly with Marburg, where their permit right now for example, their permit for discharging, they just put in a treatment facility, an on-site pre-treatment facility. And so we're currently working with them on revising their permit to recognizing that their discharge is different. And we're coming up with different intervals for when their testing needs to be done. And so that's in process right now.
Okay, so I worded my question poorly. What I was trying to get at is when our customers are submitting samples for ammonia, for example, are those results consistent with the city's kind of auditing sampling that's going on?
I'm not aware of any major discrepancies, and when there are discrepancies, because again, it's not the customer who's submitting it, it's the lab who's submitting it, a certified lab. And so when there are issues, we'll sit down and work through, and sometimes we'll take an average. It really just depends on the situation and the constituent. In that case, maybe we'll resample because it just was so unusual. So it's a case by case. There isn't a lot of there is not a lot of high strength dischargers in our community. We don't have very many.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
I would also like to add that those that are high strength, we have relationships with them, and if for some reason they say a brewery is going to have a bad batch, we have them contact us before they dump it to eliminate kind of that high strength surcharge, so we can work together in how to dispose that properly so it does not impact our treatment system.
Thank you.
So on the next slide, we start getting into some of the bill comparisons, and I'm going to turn it back over to Ms. Hoffenberg to walk you through some of these comparisons.
Okay, hello again, everyone. So we're going to reset a little bit. We're going to be looking back at single family bills. So we just wanted to put this in context for everyone a bit. So this chart is showing us an bill comparison for a City of Santa Barbara wastewater customer compared to some neighboring agencies. So a couple of points to keep in mind here. This is comparing our proposed rates that we have proposed today in comparison to our neighboring agencies' current rates. Our neighbor agencies didn't have their proposed rates ready yet, so that's why we're just using their current rates. So keep in mind that it is possible that our neighboring agencies' rates will be changing, probably increasing given everything that's going on. So that's why it says FY23 city rates compared to FY22 neighboring agencies. Our neighboring agencies also have a different approach of billing their customers than we do. As we've discussed, we have a volumetric component for our customers. Our neighboring agencies just have a flat charge, annual flat charge. So that's why it's going to look a little bit different as we go through the different water usage. So you'll see this is for a single family residential user, a low water user, so a low discharger, only for HCF. And you can see we're on the left there. So we have a pretty low bill compared to our neighbors. Next slide, please. So this is more of an average discharger for single family residential compared to our neighbor agencies. Of course, we're still right in the pack, and I anticipate we'll still be right in the pack after our neighbor agencies have changes to their FY23 rates. Next slide, please. So as you know, we are a full service city. We have many different things that we charge for on our utility bills. We have water service, wastewater service, and trash and recycling service. And so a single family customer who has all those services will receive one bill with all of those services on them. So we wanted to give you an idea of what that bill would look like given all of our proposed increases. So we did do a water rate study in the past. So our water rates for this next coming fiscal year are already set. We are, of course, working on our wastewater rates now, and then solid waste, and which is trash and recycling, is also working on a rate study. So they have provided us their draft rates. It's possible for these rates might be changing, but this is a pretty good idea of what the solid waste impacts will be. So overall, looking at an average single family residential customer, this is the most typical customer we have in the city, an average water user, an average wastewater discharger. We're looking at about a little less than $12 per month, a difference in their total utility bill from the city. Next slide, please. Okay, so just going over next steps, we wanting to finalize our technical analysis based on any input we get today from the Water Commission. We also have another portion that we're going to be going over, which is our capacity charges. And then we're going to be presenting our final recommendations in March, Finance Committee in March. We're going to do a public rate notice, and then we're going to have a public webinar talking about the rates for people who want to have questions or just want to be more involved in May, and then our public hearing in June. And Joshua, did you have anything you'd like to add?
Yes, thank you. Commissioner Davis and commissioners, one of the things that would be really helpful for staff today, we will be back on March 17th to talk about capacity fees. So that will be an admin item. But one of the questions that we had, and it really depended on the discussion today, is whether or not you want us to bring back the final rate notice as an admin item next month, or go ahead and put it on consent so that you can see what we're actually proposing before it goes to Finance Committee. And we serve at your pleasure, so whatever you'd like to do on that, but we just would be helpful to get some direction.
Well, I'll open it up to the commission to see if there are any comments at this point. Anyone want to weigh in on that?
Well, not on, I wasn't thinking about that specifically, but I think it would be good to have it as a recommendation so we can actually see it, see what the recommendation is likely to be, and then we can go ahead and either vote on it or comment on it and before it goes forward. But yeah.
And that would be the intent of it on consent. It would be there, you get to see the full package, and you get to make a recommendation to Finance Committee. That would be the packet. It's just whether you want another presentation on the wastewater rates, because we don't see them changing from what was presented today. So if that was the anyway, that was the intent there.
And again, just to note, if there's something of some interest, we can pull it off consent. Even though it's on consent, we can always pull it off. Other commissioners want to weigh in on that question? Oh, Arturo, you still?
No, not on that question. I have some other questions.
Okay.
No, I agree with Arturo, so that's helpful.
Yeah, as well as I.
Okay, there you go.
So,
Joshua?
well, my question is with respect to, we're seeing, unusual levels of inflation everywhere. And I know we just completed this study, but one can imagine that things like the upgrades to the El Estero Center in terms of its electrical equipment, as well as even operational costs, are going to probably change significantly. How robust is the current analysis to looking at those changes that we may have in the near and midterm future?
We've done our best to try and mitigate those. You'd see we have a 3.5% inflation plan for the next 3 years. So we're planning for 10%, roughly ends up being about 10% inflation over the next 3 years. Our current rates for construction are reflective of what we've seen kind of this year. So we've projected that out. We've kind of incorporated the accelerated inflation that we've seen this year. And with those large capital projects, they are going to be loans. So the impacts are somewhat mitigated in the future. We may need to make adjustments in our next rate study, but we've done our best. Now, again, hopefully the feds get their hands on this inflation and start to bring that down. But we're all cognizant of that's going to have impacts on our lending, right? So the lending rate right now for SRF loans is 1.5%. It's incredible. And we could find ourselves a year or two from now looking at 3%. So almost doubling the interest. Still an amazing interest rate, but that's something that we're also keeping a close eye on. And I appreciate your sensitivity to that. We're going to be watching it closely, and we'll be bringing it back to the commission and letting you know if there's any major variances and we need to do something different.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Councilmember Snedden, please. Krista.
Thank you. So I have just a quick question on something else in regard to this. Is this a good time for that? Or?
I was wondering, Joshua, where are we in the presentation?
This is it. Sorry, we're done.
Okay, great. Go ahead.
Well, first it's been such careful calculations and work, and it really does feel like everything has been considered, and just want to appreciate that first off. And then I don't know what difference this would make or not, or if it's even reasonable, but I was just wondering about Measure C funds to offset any of the capital increases or replacements or improvements, since it is infrastructure. And would it even make a difference based on where our rates are really coming from and what they need to be applied to? So that was really helpful, the graph that broke out what went to administration needs or customer service versus actual infrastructure. But is that something that could be considered, or if it would even make a difference?
Yeah, Councilmember Snedden, great question, because it does come up a lot. When Measure C was passed, it was very broad, right? For the discretion of the city council, they could use it. They could use it on water infrastructure, but it was not how it was sold to the public. It was intended for more general fund capital expenditures and such. And so certainly it's within the purview of the council, but it really wasn't the intent of Measure C. And I think from my understanding of Measure C, it's pretty well spoken of with all the capital improvements they need for streets, police, fire. There's quite a few of the library improvements. There's just a lot there. I think it's pretty full. So, fortunately, unfortunately, we do have a really good SRF loans that we could go after, and we have the ability to adjust our rates to reflect the work that needs to be done, unlike a lot of those other general fund capital work.
Thank you. It's just a question that does come up, and I really appreciate your answer on that. And I think that is appropriate with that. And I don't think that these rates smoothed over time like they're presented here, they don't seem overburdensome. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, we tried to strike that balance. Thank you.
Other comments or questions from the commission at this time? I'm going to look to the clerk to see. Madam Clerk, is there anyone from the public who wishes to speak on this item?
Chair Davis, we do not have public comment at this time.
Okay. So this is a presentation for discussion and review by the commission. We will be coming back next month. Joshua, did you get the direction you needed relative to consent versus a full agenda item?
Yeah. Yes, and just to summarize, we'll be bringing this back. You'll see the full packet that's going to go to Finance Committee. It will be on consent for a recommendation, and if the commission wants to pull it off and have a conversation, we'll be prepared for that. And then on the admin item, we will be talking specifically about capacity fees or buy-in fees, because we have not had a good conversation because the wastewater rates have been taking up that that space. So we'll be back hopefully to present that and get some directions on how you would like us to proceed with that.
Good. Thank you very much. And thanks to everybody on the team for the presentations leading up to here. It's been very helpful in the way you've structured our education and allowing us to input along the way. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Will take us to the next item. That is item 6B on our agenda. This is what is direct potable reuse and what are some of the key considerations for its implementation in California. Looking forward to this discussion. Mr. Hagmark or Dr. Keller. Arturo, would you like to open this one up?
Yeah, I can just start off real quick. I just really appreciate Commissioner Keller offering to do this. This has obviously been a hot topic for our community, and there's a lot of information out there right now, and really just wanting to keep the dialogue going. I think that the healthiest thing right now, I don't want to panic anybody. I'm not intended, we're here to educate. There's a lot of great research being done right now. The state is making slow but steady progress, and Commissioner Keller has been following this really closely along with his students and really wanted to bring back a recap, and hopefully I can talk him into doing it again in the future because this is a really important topic. Thank you. Take it away, Commissioner Keller.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And good morning, everyone. So I'm going to be talking today about what is direct potable reuse, just, so we understand what do we really mean by this and what do we need to think about when we implement it. And I think about it broadly. I mean, it's not just Santa Barbara, it's California. In fact, it's anywhere around the world that, we need to think about these different aspects. But it's particularly important for us here in California, given the situation that we have in terms of water supply. So if we can go to the next slide. First, what is it? So of course, we understand that what we're talking about is taking wastewater to treatment levels that are going to make it potable. And so what we're doing is we're closing that urban water cycle. And I have a diagram coming up where I'll show, what we mean by closing that urban water cycle. But again, it's the reuse of our wastewater into potable levels. And it will be meeting California Title 22 requirements. And it should be treated to a level where it's going to be safe to use, reliable, more sustainable, no increase in public health or environmental risks. So that's the goal that, this will be, and these 3 points are really important, reliable, more sustainably than other options that we may have, and without increasing public health or environmental risks. And also for our communities, it will mean reducing our dependence on remote and in many cases, unreliable water sources, as we'll see in a minute. So next slide. So just a quick recap. I know the Water Commission is quite familiar with many of these topics, but just for the public that may be listening to this, where does our water come from? It's important to think about that. We have a significant amount of our water coming from local surface waters, both Cachuma and Gibraltar reservoirs. But those are quite variable. They're very dependent on our climate. And as we see, we've had a number of drought years, and it looks like that will be kind of the new normal to have more and more of these very dry years. So our local surface water is quite dependent on the climatic conditions that we may have. Another important source is the Sierra Nevada, and by that we mean bringing water from the Sierras down to our local communities through the State Water Project. So, and there are other projects that bring that to other communities. This is specific for Santa Barbara that we're talking about here. And so that's a fraction, but again, a very unreliable fraction because unfortunately, as we know, the snowpack is very inconsistent and the ability to bring water varies tremendously from year to year. The third one is local groundwater, and that includes Mission Tunnel. So the Mission Tunnel has seeping water, which is considered to be kind of a local groundwater. And that's a small fraction. We see there in the diagram that it's a fairly small fraction in terms of groundwater. We don't have a very large aquifer that we can tap to. So it's something that we can rely on, but we have to sort of let it sit around and rebuild itself so that it fills again and we can use it reliably. The other one is recycled or reclaimed non-potable water for irrigation, and that's that purple down at the bottom. And that has been growing and increasing. There's a limited demand for it because, of course, it's for large-scale irrigation mostly. It's non-potable water, so we cannot use it for residential irrigation, for example. And so it's something that we need to, and it's also very dependent on the season demand, which for example, during the winter months decreases a lot and then increases significantly in the rest of the year. And then finally, we have our desalination plant. And so that's been something that has been growing and is becoming an important part of our overall portfolio. So, and last but not least, is extraordinary conservation shown at the very top of the right-hand bar chart there, which is what we used to call extraordinary conservation, really our citizens and our community really helping to bring down the demand for water, and which now is becoming the new normal as we all adjust to the need to continue to conserve and to be much more careful about our water use. So we have these as our water sources, and we see there the change, the historical times up to 2019, and then the most recent drought showing a significant change in the way that we are bringing our water. We have a very diversified portfolio, but many of these elements are at somewhat risk. So the idea is to see how much can we reuse our wastewater, which represents a significant water supply if we can make it safe and reliable. Next slide. The other important thing is that we've been able to decouple growth and water use. And that's a very important thing. We see there in this diagram, the city population from the early 1900s all the way to the present, or very close to the present, how the city population has continued to grow more slowly in the last few decades. But our production of water, shown there in the green line, has actually decreased significantly. We hit a peak in 1984 of 16,000, and we're now down to somewhere around 10,000, 11,000 acre feet per year of consumption. So we have really decoupled this. And a lot of that has been this conservation and our change in our landscaping. And so shown there on the right-hand side, if your landscape looks like this, you're doing your job. We need to do more of this where we have people really saving water, particularly on the outdoor uses, which is the most significant use. And of course, also indoors with more water efficient appliances. Next slide. So what I mean by closing the urban water cycle, we're going to take a look at this diagram. And to look at the diagram, start out on the lower right-hand side where it says start. So there, we're taking our waters from our groundwater or a reservoir, for example, Cachuma or Gibraltar or other reservoirs that other communities may have, or other surface water sources. And it's brought into the system, and we are going to go up on the right-hand side. The raw water influent, we have some tanks or reservoirs to hold that water, and it goes through the process of coagulation, sedimentation, filtration, disinfection to make it potable. So this is our traditional treatment for our potable water. And then that's distributed to the community. And the arrow up above shows how that then returns back on the left-hand side to the wastewater treatment plant. And that's the raw influent for the wastewater treatment plant. And as we just talked about, that has influence from domestic water use, commercial, industrial. And so all of these different users provide this water back to the system. And then it goes through the thirdly traditional processes of primary treatment, just removing everything that can be removed by coarse grids. Then biological treatment, which is very important to reduce the suspended solids, the ammonia that we talked about a little bit before, the biochemical oxygen demand, all of these different constituents that are present in our wastewater. Then there's sedimentation, and then we go into advanced tertiary treatment processes. And this is where our direct polar reuse can come into play. The level of treatment that we can achieve there can take that water to very different treatment levels. It can be treated to basically just meet our discharge requirements. We have a permit, we have a discharge requirements. We meet those, and the water then gets put out into some environmental reservoir. For example, it may go into the coastal areas, or in other communities, it may go into a river or so, meeting discharge requirements to make sure it's safe for the environment. Or as we do with some fraction of our current wastewater, it can be treated to non-potable recycled water. So that's sent out in our purple pipes out to irrigation purposes mostly. In some other communities are beginning to use that more and more for agriculture, again, with some restrictions as to the type of agriculture that can be used. And so that's another possibility for that. And then the one that we're looking at today is potable water treatment. So taking that wastewater all the way to potable water, and that would be at the very bottom of the left-hand side. And there we have two options, two main options. Well, actually three, but the most important ones in terms of potable would be, one would be to return it to the start point. So to augment the raw water that we are going to be needing. So that's an option, and that's called indirect potable reuse. So we're not directly sending it to the consumer, but we're indirectly bringing it into our water treatment plant and being able then to put it through this process and just to give it another polishing step before we put it into our distribution system. The other option is to take the treated water into that emergency buffer reservoir, kind of a small reservoir that would be there for if we have any emergencies in terms of water quality or other concerns that we may have with that water, be able to hold it there for a certain holding time, and then it would be distributed directly to the customer. So that would be our direct potable reuse option. Next slide, please. So treating it, how do we treat that water to potable reuse levels?
Commissioner Keller, I think Commissioner Young had a question.
Okay.
It's hard to see on the screen.
I do, if you don't mind.
Yeah,
Back on this screen. So if we were to look at the quality of the water at the bottom of the left side of our chart after disinfection, and then compare that quality to what we have on the right side after disinfection, what are the main differences that we would find? They've both gone through disinfection processes. The one on the left has gone through advanced tertiary treatment.
Yeah.
But what is it that stands out that is so different?
Excellent question. So there are differences because, of course, the water that's coming from our groundwater or our reservoir is basically water that has not been influenced by our human activities. There are some activities that still affect some of our reservoirs or even our groundwaters, but by and large, they're not have not been affected by most urban activities. Whereas the water coming in from the wastewater treatment plant will contain some residues of, for example, pharmaceuticals, personal care products, perhaps even some industrial discharges. So we'll talk about some of those in a few more slides. What are the constituents that are of concern and why the state has not yet gone forward and say, we approve direct potable reuse, because we want to make sure, absolutely sure, that it's safe for the long-term use. This is going to be a supply that we may include in our portfolio for the very, very long term. And so we want to make sure that it's safe for that long-term use.
So I think what you're saying is that at the bottom of the left-hand side, we have chemicals of emerging concern show up, which we don't have on the right-hand side after disinfection.
Yeah, basically, yes.
Okay,
yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. And if we go back to that slide just for a second, yes. So I have there these little starts, which are sort of some recommended sampling points, which, as we'll talk about monitoring, will be important to keep in mind that we would like to have continuous monitoring of these sampling points because that will be important in terms of making sure it's reliable. So next slide. So I was talking about the most likely treatments that we'll have are what's called micro and ultrafiltration. These are basically steps to remove most of the chemicals that we have of concern, but the pore sizes for these micro and ultrafiltration are still too large for some of the molecules that we need to remove. So they serve to sort of do a pre-treatment before it goes to the next steps, but they're not effective in completely removing things. So then we go into a very, very fine pore, and I'll show a diagram in a couple more slides of what reverse osmosis is. So reverse osmosis is going to remove many salts that are present in our wastewater. Humans, as we know, consume a lot of salt, and not just sodium chloride, but other salts, potassium, and other things that we may be consuming. And so we need to remove some of these things from our waters. So that first of it is some of the salts. Also, many of the organic molecules that may be from personal care products, pharmaceuticals, as well as industrial discharges or other things that may be still left behind after all the treatment process. So reverse osmosis is another barrier for removing all of these. So making sure that we don't have that. And then finally, advanced oxidation. So advanced oxidation, it means that we're taking some source, for example, either ultraviolet light with hydrogen peroxide or ozone, and to really oxidize any organics that may be still be left behind. So the idea is to try to do a very, very complete treatment. There's also a final disinfection step, as was mentioned before. This is just to be, again, an extra layer of security to make sure that even after all of these steps, if there's any pathogen that may be present in our waters, it would be disinfected. So the idea is to have a very robust treatment train, that's called a very robust treatment set of processes. And there's also discussion, I don't have it here, of using biologically activated carbon, which is also a good source of treatment for many of these chemicals. So it's been discussed now by the state and by others, and we'll see it a little later on. This is actually very similar to what we do in desalination treatment. We use micro and ultrafiltration, reverse osmosis, advanced oxidation, disinfection. It's just that because it contains so much more salt, the reverse osmosis process is quite a bit more intensive in terms of removing a large amount of salt. But it's a very similar treatment train. And we see there in the pictures what a reverse osmosis membrane system looks like, very similar to what we have in our city, as well as an advanced oxidation system, which we also have, for example, in our Cater treatment plant for our regular water to do disinfection. So the next question is, what can be achieved? So very high removal of most pollutants. In most cases, it's down to levels of non-detect, even with today's very advanced instruments, where we can detect many of these contaminants down to not only parts per billion, but even a tenth of a part per billion in some cases. So very high removal of most pollutants, very high removal of salts. And in fact, it's such a high removal of salts that you actually have to add back in some minerals. Just like with desalination, it's so effective in removing salts that the water has no calcium, for example, and we need calcium for our bones. So it's important for us to keep that in the system. And so it has to be added back in. Very, very high removal of pathogens such as bacteria, viruses. And the reason for that is in the diagram shown on the right-hand side. It's a little busy, but let me take your attention to the right-hand side of the diagram. And you see there the size of the pore membrane. They vary a little bit, but they have it there as 0.0005 micrometers. So there you go. Very, very small pore size. Much smaller than the size of a typical bacteria, which is somewhere on the order of 0.2 to 1 microns. Even viruses viruses are usually about 0.1 micron. So much, much, much smaller than the typical bacteria or virus. We also see in the diagram how different dissolved solids, different dissolved salts, for example, sodium and calcium and chloride and magnesium, are not allowed to go through the membrane. So they are rejected by the membrane, in part because of the pore size and in part because of the charge on the membrane. So the membrane rejects these ions. And so the water that goes into the purified side, the center part of that diagram, is very, very, very clean water with almost no salts and very few other chemicals. Next slide. So going back to Commissioner Young's question, why are we concerned? Well, there are some molecules that we are concerned about. Very, very small neutral molecules. So as I mentioned, the membrane has a charge, but the molecules are neutral. In other words, they have no charge, like some pharmaceuticals and some disinfection byproducts. They could make it through the membrane. At levels that are really very low, again, we're talking about less than a part per billion in most studies. And so we're seeing very, very low levels, but it's a concern where we have some of these chemicals making it through. Some inorganic ions, it's unlikely that we would have much arsenic, but if a source somewhere else in the state would have arsenic, it could be something to consider. Bromate from disinfection, very present at very low concentrations, but the question is, what are the health effects if you're exposed to this on a long-term basis, the chronic exposure? And the list there is showing some of the chemicals that are of concern. The state has identified these and is regulating to try to make sure that we basically keep these down to very, very, very low levels if they cannot be removed completely. Next slide. So how do we monitor them? Well, one option is, as we've seen in the previous discussion, we can take samples in different locations and send them to the laboratory. And again, we have very advanced instruments today that can detect even parts per trillion in some cases. So really, really be able to detect them at very low levels, levels that would not cause concern. So we can make sure that in fact, but that is a time-consuming step in the sense that you have to take the sample, send it to the laboratory, maybe get some results, hopefully a few hours later, sometimes days later. And that would imply for many, many facilities to have a very advanced laboratory in-house. So that's one option. The one that's evolving now and that's becoming more and more a possibility is real-time monitoring. It's the idea here is that you would have sensors directly online to be able to detect the contaminants that are concerned. It needs to be 100% reliable, so it will probably have multiple detectors in the system, multiple points where we were looking at, make sure that it can target those specific contaminants at the levels that we're looking for, and they'll likely be multi-sensor so that one sensor can detect many, but you may have to have some for some, let's say the organics, another for some of the other chemicals that we're concerned, like the arsenic and bromate. Any questions there? Okay. So here's just an example of one of the molecules that is of concern. It's called NDMA. It's a long name, so just NDMA for now. It's a disinfection byproduct. So this occurs when we're doing disinfection. It gets generated and it may remain in our system. And so the idea here would be, starting out from the left-hand side, that you would have some online monitoring before, for example, the reverse osmosis, and another monitoring point after the reverse osmosis to see what was the rejection. Were you able to get to really good rejection? And shown there are the results in terms of rejection for different types of membranes and looking at this online monitoring. So we're getting there to the point where we can do advanced monitoring on real time of many of these important molecules that I've been discussing with. And so discussing about. So this is something that's more and more of a reality, but we probably will have to wait until it's real there before we can consider direct potable reuse for most applications. Next slide. The other aspect that one needs to think about is energy. So pushing water through very small pores, typically 0.5 nanometers or even less in some cases, requires a lot of energy. So that's really the main point, that we need to sort of squeeze this water through those pores, and that's going to require a lot of energy to do that. We can see there in the diagram that the energy water ratio for the top one there is the process that I mentioned before. It's microfiltration with reverse osmosis, UV, and hydrogen peroxide. That would require about 2.5 kilowatt hours per cubic meter. That would be quite a bit. Also, even if it was ozone with reverse osmosis, would be quite significant. The third one there is microfiltration with ozone and biologically activated carbon. That's quite a bit less. And so that's why there's a lot of interest in getting this BAC process approved. Now, it may still be that you need RO as a final step, but maybe we can use BAC to reduce some of the costs in terms of the energy requirements. So we can see there that they are significant. And the lower processes shown there are just to show what these individual processes may be and how they stack up. And the big one is the reverse osmosis, the nanofiltration or microfiltration. Reverse osmosis is the one that really drives up the energy consumption. Now, this has to be put into consideration with respect to other things, like bringing water from Northern California to Southern California also requires a lot of energy. We have to do a lot of pumping, which is very energy intensive, and lifting a lot of water over mountain ranges, which again requires a lot of water. There is some recovery as the water comes down, but still it's very intensive. So when we talk about this requires a lot of energy, we need to put it into context of what are our options. And if the option is to bring water from Northern California, well, that's also a very energy intensive water. The other important thing is that we must use renewable energy. And so I say here it can be used, but I think in the future, we need to think about it must be used. That would be one way to address this. Next slide. Other issues with direct potable reuse. Direct means no room for error. So you have to be prepared for equipment failures, the operator errors, accidental releases, security issues. So that's why having redundancy in our equipment, having monitoring that's directly online so we can avoid any operator errors, making sure that accidental releases we have a plan for dealing with them, and so on. So those are important aspects that have to be taken into consideration. One alternative is to go indirect. And in fact, that's probably one of the better options, for example, for the city of Santa Barbara to consider indirect potable reuse, where we have a sufficient storage time so that we sort of minimize the possibility for all of these potential issues. You also have the disposal of the reverse osmosis brine. These are concentrated residuals of the chemicals of concern and salts. So we need to sort of think about that in general. So that's important. It's a high cost of treatment. So this will be a significantly more expensive water than most of our other sources, but it compares against having no water in some places. So it'll be important for many communities. We also, because the wastewater treatment plant is at the low end of our distribution system, we need to pump that water up gradient. And so in many communities, that will be another energy consideration. Pumping water up gradient means putting energy into the system. And so that's going to be important. And also for our community here, we are very well knit in terms of our one water system, where there's no issues between our water treatment and our wastewater treatment. In other communities, they need to work on that because they are separate entities, and those water agencies have to work together to make this a reality. Next question, next slide. So my recommendations for DPR is to conserve. Next slide, conserve and conserve. So the point here is that before we even think about direct potable reuse for our community, we need to make sure that we've taken every step we can to conserve more and more and more. So that's really important. But more seriously, on the next slide, it's still serious. One is to establish online and real-time water quality monitoring systems. We need to be able to get there. We're not quite there. Several years until commercial systems have the reliability that we need to be able to make this a reality. We need redundancy in treatment processes to ensure high level of removal, which will require high level of investment. It'll be an expensive operation to make sure that it's redundant and reliable. We need to think about emergency storage and plans for dealing with off-spec water. Large enough storage, in some cases weeks, near the treatment plant in case you have a certain batch or treatment amount that you have to hold. And then also think about if you have to discharge that off-spec water, where would it go? So that has to be part of the planning going forward. As I mentioned before, we must use renewable energy. And it also leads for thinking about creative times to treat. Should we be treating most of our wastewater during peak solar production to make use of the fact that that's more abundant at that point? So that will, we have to sort of begin to think very creatively of how to use our renewable energy resources. And then assess the implementation of DPR very, very carefully. And then the final check is, again, conserve, conserve, conserve. Next slide. So thank you for your attention. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
No, thank you, Arturo. That was a great presentation, really informative. And well, I've been thinking about this for a long time, really raised even new questions for me. So thank you for that. Questions from the commission. I have Councilmember Snedden and then Commissioner Young.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I love this presentation. I want to take your classes. This is amazing, really. And I'll be referring this, people to watch this to really understand the big picture. And it's all these little threads that we've been talking about, but this is all in one place and technical enough to really see the real issues, and then also big picture enough. And really fantastic, and thank you. And I just have a question. I guess for the city, are we on track with these considerations to be looking at this long term? And what are we doing in the meantime, say these real-time monitoring or different steps along the way? Will we be ready when the time comes that we'll be able to do this if we needed to?
Well, I can take a stab
Yeah,
at that, and then
the city, I think it's better for Joshua.
So I think the beginning part is to having this conversation, right? So it's talking about what are the pros and the cons, talking about where the gaps are in technology, is part of it. If someone were to say that DPR is going to be a reality in 15 years, we need to start now with the education process. Because if someone came to me and said, "You're drinking your wastewater next year," I'm going to say, "No, we're not." I mean, it's just a natural response. And so I think to get there is, again, having this kind of public conversation, continuing to address the concerns. I'm not here advocating for DPR, but saying it's going to be part of our reality. And so how do we do it in a mindful way? And I envision a process in which, when at some point doing a small scale pilot, having the community come down and look at it, taste it, smell it, like it's just part of this larger process. I think we included it in our enhanced urban water management plan. We don't think it's in the next few years, but we do see it in the future. And how do you start to change that dialogue? And Commissioner Keller coming to speak today, this is great. And how do we continue to advance this? You talking with your friends and your neighbors is part of that continued conversation. And what we've really, staff level, we're talking a lot about is the sewer shed. Like, what do we put in our sewer shed? You really start to think mindfully about what you eat, put in your body, put down the sewer, if you know that you're ultimately, that's coming back around. So it's taken a lot of education on many levels. I think we're going to be talking about deployment of sensors in the sewer shed to be able to tell if something foreign is in there, something that doesn't belong in our sewer system was dumped in there. But the technology to get there is I think there's investments going into it, but there's a lot more investments that need to continue to happen in that monitoring. I really appreciate you highlighting that, because the monitoring is, I think, really the key to making this possible.
Yeah. And if I may add, that's why the state is going very, very slowly in considering the regulations for the direct boiler reuse. They are very conscious of all these different issues. And so they're going very carefully, very methodically, talking to many experts. I was at a meeting just a few weeks ago where we heard about many experts talking about their considerations. And so I think this is something that we're going to take into consideration very, very carefully. We probably will see the city of San Diego being one of the first ones to take this on. They're kind of in a very tough situation in terms of water supply, so they may be leaders, but I think our city also, in terms of just being aware, is way up there in terms of leadership, understanding what are the considerations, what do we need to be thinking about. But we're definitely years away from any solid consideration of direct boiler reuse.
And then just one more for the cost of pushing water uphill. And now that we are connecting our desal to Cater, would that be part of that cost already taken care of, or is it just the volume and the energy to bring that uphill even once the infrastructure is in place?
I think one of the benefits of putting that line up is that we'll have the infrastructure in place to be able to do that. We'll have the pipes and maybe some changes to the pumping system, but generally we'll have what we need. But we do need to think about the fact that pushing that water up requires energy, and so that's important. It's a factor.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Commissioner Young, Jeff.
Thank you. Great presentation, Arturo. Great slides, and you condensed down a kind of a complicated presentation into something that's quite visually easy to follow. In your general research in this area, have you come across any indications that our offshore discharge of chemicals of emerging concern pose any harm or threat of harm to the environment?
So far, I mean, from what I've seen, our levels are very, very low. And of course, there's a huge dilution factor as soon as they get into the ocean, into the coastal margins. So there's no, I haven't seen anything that indicates that we have a problem with our discharge at present. Not only ours, but I don't see that, as something that has been observed in most communities. I think it's something to keep in mind, and we probably should be thinking, broadly about how do we address this. But I think by having these treatment systems, we're reducing a lot of those concentrations. But yeah.
And I guess the companion question to that is, are we even looking for such impacts?
In some places, yes, but many of those chemicals of emerging concern are not regulated. So the state here in California, for example, has implemented some programs to start looking at them, just to sort of know where are we. And in fact, for example, there's a study to look at a particular class of chemicals, the PFAS, which have become very important in terms of their potential long-term implications. And so there was a study to look at those, and the state is sort of looking at a number of emerging contaminants, figure out what should be regulated, what should be monitored on a regular basis, and so on. So they're working on it.
So at another time, you and I will have a cup of coffee or a cup of tea and talk about these things.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Sure.
I want to be a fly on the wall at that conversation.
You're welcome, Dave.
Okay, other questions or comments from the commission? I have one, and that is, Arturo, I love your conserve.
Yeah.
But I'm going to question directed more towards staff and Mr. Hagmark. Right. One thing I just kept reading in here is we need space. Right. And I know that space is limited. So again, you can't start early enough letting the community through the council know that in fact, the water resources in the future is going to need space in a very limited environment. It's going to be further constrained by sea level rise. So again, this presentation, boom, just opened my mind to lots of thinking as to there's never too soon to start thinking about what's needed next in that regard.
Love that segue, Chair Davis. I mean, that's right in line with Councilmember Sneddon's, like, is it, when is the time to start talking about it? And it is, and start planking. And, we're fortunate that we embarked already on a potable reuse study. So we've kind of got general ideas of where some of these facilities would go, but space is such a challenge for us here in Santa Barbara. And then you layer on top of it sea level rise, which just further complicates that. Absolutely. So yes, I think the more we can talk about it, be mindful about it in our conversations, at the council level, talking about city planning, that we ensure that at least the opportunity to pivot to potable reuse remains wherever we head as a community in our land use planning. I think that's really important. Thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, it's an emphasis that the Commissioner Keller made, that indirect is a lot better, safer, whatever, than direct. But indirect needs, given our groundwater basis, needs reservoirs, and that's again just a driver for more capital space needs for the system. So, Madam Clerk, do we have anyone from the public who wishes to comment on this interesting item?
Chair Davis, we do have public comment. Let me navigate to the timer.
Go ahead.
Okay, we have Miss Hillary Hauser.
Hillary Hauser here. Thank you so much. And Arturo, thank you for the incredible presentation you've given. And I'm going to come out to your classes too. Heal the Ocean, on this business of potable reuse. I'm a broken record saying we're waiting for Godot. As far as the state is concerned, a lot of the CEC research is being done by SCWRP, the Southern California Water Research Group in Costa Mesa. Heal the Ocean been going to each one of those presentations since it started. As recently as last week, Allison in the Heal the Ocean office tuned in on their recent session on CECs. And they're, in answer to Jeff Young's question, they have been looking and looking and looking for the effects of CEC on marine animals as well as freshwater animals. They don't seem to be getting, moving forward at any great speed. And so I'm going to say again that, the city of Santa Barbara has the ability to make a lot of recycled water. Most water is spent on irrigation, and it's a reverse way of making potable water by not using it for irrigation. And so I'd like to know if we've done an estimate on the volume that we could be saving on potable supplies by upping the recycled water production for irrigation and so forth. And I know that one of the arguments is that recycled water is just as expensive as potable. Nobody wants it, but it seems to me that in the drought and what's going on, that this, I'm sorry, I'm going to wrap. This should be looked at. I'd like to see volume versus volume and see how we can get more recycled water use to save potable use. Thank you.
Thank you.
Chair Davis, if you don't mind, I'll take a stab at that. That's exactly what the commission weighed in on last month, which was this recycled water market study. So we're going to be looking at how much we could potentially maximize. And Ms. Hauser, if you could hang out towards the end of the meeting, I have some news related to the agreement with the Cumbra that I think you'll find really interesting and potentially a ribbon cutting ceremony for you to attend. So
oh, good.
More on that. Yeah.
Mr. Hagmark, I'm seeing that Chair Davis has dropped off, and perhaps Vice Chair Young could take over.
Keep this going.
I'm right here. So
okay, good. All right.
Didn't catch that. So.
Okay, and Vice Chair Young, there is no more public comment, so let me move on to the next presentation.
Okay, Mr. Hagmark, you want to lead us through that?
Yes, I have with us today Kathy Taylor, who's going to walk us through a water agency update. And I realize we have about 15 minutes, which I think is about the length of her presentation. And then I'll note that I have about, I don't know, 5 to 7 minutes after that for the water resources report, just to give you a heads up. All right.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, good,
I'm back.
Good morning, Chair Davis. Good to see you and the commissioners and Councilmember Snedden. I am Kathy Taylor, the city's water services, supply and services manager, and I'm here to provide a water agency's update. And I will warn you in advance that this presentation uses many acronyms, so I apologize. Next slide, please. So with overview of my presentation, I'll be speaking about the Central Coast Water Authority, or CCWA, the Cachuma Operations Maintenance Board, or COAM, Santa Barbara County Office of Emergency Management, or SBCOEM, and the Cachuma Conservation Release Board, or CCRB. Next slide, please. This is a slide from CCWA, and it is the 8-station index of water monitoring stations of precipitation in Northern California. And as you can see, it's historic averages here as from 1991 to 2020. As you can see in the blue there, that is where the average was or is over in recent years. We've been below average, as you can see where we were in 2019, 2020, and 2020 to 2021. However, this year started off with our water year started off with a bang, and we were doing really well. And as you can see, it's I think it's a blue line, and things were looking good, except it's sort of the rain sort of petered out just after the new year. But even though we feel like we've been very dry, according to this 8-station index, we are on average. If you think about it, we're right there on average. What this means is that our state water project water allocation, it started out October 1st at 0%. With the rain that we got through the end of December, it went up to 15%, which was good news. This also means that there is a possibility that supplemental water will be available for purchase, and I will be speaking about that later in my presentation. Next slide, please. CCWA, they've been working on a water management study, and they wrapped that up and they adopted it at their last January meeting. The primary recommendations for us that came out of it was that the CCWA explore a shared conveyance capacity program among the coastal branch contractors. They also explore a program to transfer excess Table A water, which is our state water project allocation between, I love this acronym, the San Luis Obispo Flood Control and Water Conservation District and CCWA, and explore an external storage and exchange program for the coastal branch contractors, and lastly, explore supplemental groundwater supply options. And I enjoy this picture of the aqueduct here. I hope you appreciate it as well. Next slide, please. CCWA is also working on the WARN Act renewal, and the WARN Act enables CCWA to deliver non-Cachuma project water, which is state water project water, to Cachuma. The current contract extension expires in June 2022, and CCWA has had a difficult time engaging the USBR, United States Bureau of Reclamation, on negotiations. So CCWA is wanting another 3 to 5 year extension because at this point there's not enough time to negotiate with the USBR a new long-term contract. The CCWA board also has asked the USBR to have a short-term contract in place for CCWA's April board meeting for approval. Next slide, please. And I mentioned the supplemental water purchases. These sources would be coming from Mojave, AVEC, which is the Antelope Valley East Kern Water Agency, Casitas, Yuba, and others. And the city of Santa Barbara has requested 20,000 acre feet of supplemental water. And this would be a cost of about 1,200 to 1,400 acre feet, or a total of $2.4 million.
Taylor, I think you said 20,000 acre feet. You meant 2,000 acre feet.
2,000 acre feet. I apologize.
20,000 acre feet.
No.
We'd be sitting in it.
Extra zero there. I apologize. Thank you. But the total again, the total cost would be $2.4 million. Next slide, please. And just to remind you about Lake Cachuma and how it operates, it was designed to operate where the water flows via gravity from the lake into the intake tower through Tecolote Tunnel down to the South Coast conduit into the Cachuma memory units on this side of the mountain, entirely by gravity. It also goes through our Cater water treatment plant and is treated and delivered down throughout a lot of the city, especially the lower zone like our offices, entirely by gravity. However, when the lake got just direly low, we actually had to install a pumping station that was floating on a barge in the lake, and it would pump water via this is a picture of a pipeline that is connected to pilings, and the pipeline would float up and down on the pilings depending on the level of the lake. However, what COMA is wanting to do now is to install a secure pipeline from the intake structure to what we knew was Site 1, which is approximately 2/3 of a mile out into the lake. And then eventually the barge was moved to Site 2, but right now they're just looking at Site 1 to install a secured pipeline, again, from the intake structure to the floating barge. And the decision to install this pipeline will be made in April or May of this year. Currently, the lake elevation is 711.71 feet. Once the lake lowers to 710 feet or less, that's when it's ideal to install the secured pipeline. The latest projections, which of course are dry, the lake will reach the elevation 710 on April 22nd. and this would allow for construction to start in summer of 2022. Next slide, please. And again, construction deployment would begin in summer 2022, and it would take about 3 months. The only concern with this is the pipe procurement. They're checking now to see if the pipe is available. And I appreciate this picture here because it just shows the intake structure and the pipeline, how far out, when about 2/3 of a mile to the barge, and that's how we were getting water during the last when the lake was so direly low. And cost estimates for this, the planning is $214,000, construction is just under $3.5 million, and operations and maintenance would be about $6,000 annually. Fortunately, COME has secured $750,000 in grant funding from the USBR through their Water Smart Drought Resiliency Projects Program. Next slide, please. So COME is also looking at the emergency pumping facility, or the EPF. And before, when we were just relying on the temporary system with the pilings and the floating pipe, we had to, it took about 12 months to deploy the system. So if you think about that, you're deploying it when there's another winter coming up before you might need it. You would be needing it, and if you got a wet winter, then you've spent a lot of effort and expenditures on something that you don't need. So that was a disadvantage there. But with the secured pipeline, it would take about 4 months to deploy the emergency pumping facility. And the emergency pumping facility must be installed 45 days before the lake reaches 685. So that's the target that we back out of. And once we hit elevation 679, we lose the gravity flow. It flows, and that's when we actually have to start pumping the water from the lake to this side of the mountain. And this is a picture of the barge and the pipeline, and you can see the pilings that were supporting the floating pipeline. Next slide, please. And COME has done some modeling, and they see that the lake they're anticipating the lake will reach elevation 685 on June 15th of 2023. And again, if working backwards, deployment would be 45 days prior, or on May 1st of 2023. So with the secure pipeline, the emergency pumping facility deployment decision would be necessary by January 1st of 2023, rather than May 1st of this year, had we would still be relying on the temporary floating system. And the barge deployment, of course, depends on fish releases, conservation, state water inflows, watershed inflows, etc. And this is a picture of the barge itself, again, with the pipeline and the pilings. And it's kind of interesting, if you look at the pilings, not much are showing in this photo, but at the lake, when storms, it's a huge watershed, and when the storms really get started in the backcountry, the lake can fill quite quickly, and they have to pull out these pilings before they become submerged. Otherwise, it's near impossible, and they become a navigational nightmare for any of the pleasure boats on the lake. So they have to pull them before they are submerged, which is another tricky problem to negotiate. Next slide, please. And next, I'll talk about the Santa Barbara County Office of Emergency Management. They, along with Environmental Health Services and Santa Barbara County Water Agency, are desiring to host a biannual Santa Barbara County External Drought Task Force meeting. While we plan to participate, it's going to be difficult for the Ketchuma member units to participate. Currently, CCWA and the Ketchuma member units and its member units are in a lawsuit with the Santa Barbara County Water Agency, and currently we're in the discovery phase. And also, the Santa Barbara County Water Agency represents the Ketchuma members on the Ketchuma Master Contract Agreement with the USBR, and Santa Barbara County Water Agency requested a 60% allocation for the Ketchuma member units from the USBR, even though the Ketchuma member units requested 83%. So this kind of has put us with odds with the water agency, and the Ketchuma member units, they negotiated eventually negotiated a 70% allocation from the USBR, but we don't feel like we were really well represented by the state water agency. But Given that, we do plan on attending their meeting and being really good listeners and participating to the extent that we can. Next slide, please. CCRB and the Kachuma operations, they are active, and the Kachuma project. They are actively engaged with the USBR over the Kachuma project and in its ongoing Endangered Species Act consultation with the National Marine Fisheries Service. The consultation was required because of the USBR on the Kachuma project has the potential to affect Southern California steelhead, which is listed as an endangered under the Federal Endangered Species Act. Next slide, please. And CCRB is assisting the USBR with its compliance with this with the Department of Water Resources Water Rights Order. This requires the development and implementation of multiple plans and programs that protect steelhead and other natural resources on in the lower San Ynez River. Next slide, please. CCRB is also engaged with the California Fish and Game Commission to consider a petition that was filed to list the Southern California steelhead under the state's Endangered Species Act. There are many implications for habitat restoration and infrastructure maintenance efforts below the Bradbury Dam. By opening, the petition would open or the listing could open the water purveyors up to incidental take violations. And the Fish and Wildlife, who serve basically as staff for the Fish and Game Commission, have analyzed the petition. However, they failed to take all the stakeholder comments into consideration. Next slide. So CCRB has requested that the Fish and Game Commission remand the petition for additional analysis, specifically that they address all the stakeholders' comments. CCRB has also asked the Fish and Game Commission to approve a blanket incidental take protection for water purveyors and others who are performing habitat restoration work and infrastructure maintenance on the San Ynez River. Next slide, please. So with that, in summary, there's a lot of things going on with the water agents, and I'll take any questions that you might have. Yes,
You're on mute, David.
Councilmember Sneddon. Kristen, go ahead.
Thank you. If I could just make a comment, would that be all right?
Oh, yes, please.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So another fabulous presentation today, another place to send people with all these questions. You've taken something, many of these complex, not just acronyms, but topics and distilled it down and given us the current where we are with them. And then your photographs are amazing. So really great presentation. And then just so that the Water Commission knows, for the council voting representative for CCRB and for COMB, that's me. And then for the voting representation for the city for CCWA, that's Eric Friedman. And so those are other places where you can go to for resources on these really complex issues that we're in the middle of. And just to add to that, for COMB, the secured pipeline, I mean, that is something that's been now thoroughly studied, feasibility. It's, you know, as you mentioned, the getting the materials is the issue right now, but it's highly supported by all the member units. And then also outside of Kachuma member units, it's supported as well. So that's something that has changed over time, the support for the secured pipeline moving forward. And another thing to add to that is that it increases the water quality coming out of Kachuma because it's drawing from deeper down in the lake. So many benefits of that secured pipeline. So I'm really excited about that. And just thank you for this presentation. I always learn something new, even though I sit on those boards. So that was really helpful. Thank you.
Agree wholeheartedly. Other questions at this point? I see no other hands, Madam Clerk. Do we have anyone from the public?
Chair Davis, we do not have public comment.
Okay. Again, thank you very much for the presentation, Kathy. It's really helpful.
Thank you.
You're welcome. That moves us on to item 7. This is the Water Resources Manager's Report. Mr. Hagmark.
All right, Chair Davis, we'll do a time check. We're at 11:02, and I will work quickly through this for anybody who has to drop off. I think the one I wanted to make sure you're aware of, on March 1st, we are planning to have a valve opening ceremony, initiating delivery of recycled water to the La Cumbre Mutual Water Company. So momentous occasion. We've been working on this for a long time. La Cumbre had to put in quite a bit of piping to make this work. But we're working on that. So I just want to give you a heads up because an invitation will be coming out to the commission. You know, given the location and this is primarily intended for appointeds, electeds, and the media, because we do want to get good coverage. Certainly the public is welcome if they'd like to show up, but it's just want to do a quick ceremony celebrating a major milestone and just in time, I think, for La Cumbre. They were really looking to try and diversify their supply mix, and a real benefit to the city's ratepayers who get to now have someone helping to share in the cost of recycled water, which is fantastic. And then a heads up on March, given how dry things are being, we've accelerated our water supply planning update from May to next month. So we're going to be providing that. And I did want to just hit some high level bullets because I'm starting to get questioned. Despite the lack of rainfall in January and now February, our planning planned for worse. So that's the bottom line is a good thing. We've seen inflows into Gibraltar we were not expecting, and we're seeing a state water allocation which we were not planning for. And we're also getting indications that there is going to be supplemental water to purchase. And I say purchase, not borrow, which is great. So we're not going to be adding to that water debt that we have. So we're following those issues, but we're feeling very optimistic about where the cities is. Now, the other member agencies on the South Coast are in a different situation, and the state is in a far worse situation. So just wanted to note that because it's not the same all the way around. The city is also, I should also point out, the city's customers are doing a fantastic job with water conservation. We're hovering right around 24, 25%, our 12-month running average over 2013 again, but really still doing a fantastic job. We may need to ask, obviously, for a little additional conservation, but we'll be analyzing that and come back to you in March to talk more about that. Desal, again, coming through, not only is it providing water today, but it has allowed us to really have our groundwater wells off for the last 3 years. And it's allowed us, as you can see in this column right here, it's highlighted in gray. The city has a significant chunk of water sitting in Cachuma in the city's name, standing by, ready to help us meet the needs for at least the next 3 years. Depending on demands, may go far in exceedance of that. So anyway, we're planning on providing a comprehensive update for March, and we'll I'm not sure we'll know exactly where the state is, but we'll do our best to kind of project out what they may be asking all of us. Unfortunately, it sounds like they're working on one-size-fits-all rules, which are always challenging on that. The other one I wanted to mention, we continue to work with Cottage Hospital. We've actually entered into an arrangement with them in which we're doing now sampling 5 days a week for COVID RNA in our wastewater. Thank you, Raquel, appreciate that. So we're starting to get more data points, and it's been great because, you know, we've been sharing this data for a long time, but it's really been picking up a lot of steam. I've got a really great article from Kristen talking about, or Councilmember Snedden talking about different variants that we're finding in wastewater. Just lots of good dialogue going on there. So Cottage is trying to pull together a team really that includes UCSB folks, city wastewater staff, to really continue, whether it's COVID or other things, really continue to explore what we could get out of our wastewater resources as far as telling us about public health. So we're really excited about that, and think we can lend a lot to the public health discussion, and we're glad that it's finally getting some attention. In fact, they're looking right now into paying extra to have the samples that are being done to look for the variants that are present. So that was kind of exciting. I wanted to also note our water and wastewater revenues are coming in on budget. So we despite everything that's going on out there right now, we are looking solid financially, which is the best place to be if we're going to go into asking our community for conservation. And then I also want to note we hired a new collection superintendent, Gary Harris. At some point, we'll bring him on and introduce you all to him, but really excited to have, we were able to get him to move up from San Diego to Santa Barbara, and he comes with a strong background in collections, and so we're excited to see what he can do with our wastewater collections group. So with that, I'd like to pause there, open it up for discussion.
Questions, comments?
Good to hear that we're in good shape. Thanks for that.
Yep, always.
And this tracking of the virus has been amazing. Yeah, really, really good. Thank you.
Absolutely.
I'll just be interested to see what happens over the next 30 days. I usually look at rainfall for us ending towards the end of March.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, fingers crossed we get some more rainfall, but we shall see.
Yeah.
Yeah, I find myself toggling back and forth between Redding and Santa Barbara. So you want, if it doesn't rain here, hopefully it's raining there. Yes. And is there, I guess, is there any public comment on?
After I was going next, any public comment?
And Chair Davis, there is no public comment.
Okay. Not hearing any public comment, I want to thank everybody, including staff, for great presentations today. And Dr. Keller, again, knocked it out of the park. I want to go to the class too. So sign me up. Our next regular meeting will be Thursday, March 17th, 2022, 9 a.m. Right now, we're still on Zoom, so we'll let you know. So, okay. Thank you, everybody. Have a good week. Stay safe.